So like I said, correlation and causation, I like to talk about it even though it's probably a pretty obvious thing for some of you. I like to make sure we go over it because not just for this class, but any kind of science type class you take at UMBC, and then when you go out, you'll kind of hear CNN and different things, news about studies that come out. I want you to be kind of critical consumers of information from science, and it's not always obvious or clear what a study's telling you. It sounds good, but not actually prove what it suggests it proves, or it sounds like it proves. In fact, just at the end of the day, of the class on Monday, yeah, I'm sorry, your name again?
What?
Your name?
Urmi.
Umi?
Urmi.
Urmi? Urmi came up, actually it was your friend, and she's, oh, you, I'm sorry, your name, yeah.
Shalini.
Shalini?
Shalini.
Shalini came up and asked me about something from one of the chapters, a sentence that read, mothers who behave seductively toward their sons have disrupted disrupted relationships with their daughters. And she was like asking me why that was true. And I didn't know that particular, so there was more to the sentence than that, but that was part of it. But looking at, now it sounds like it's making a causal statement. This, they also have this. It may or may not. That's kind of what the point of this is to get you fine-tuned to realize that statement doesn't prove causality. That was a study looking at relationships within the family and showing a correlation between one thing and another, which doesn't necessarily mean one thing leads to the other. Now, in that case, there might be some causal relationship, acting seductively towards the son. The daughter some daughters might be upset by that. I don't know what being acting seductively means in that particular case. It might be that some daughters react negatively to that. It might be that, but it might mean that behaving seductively also means that it gives the son more attention. And then maybe that's why the daughter and the mom don't get along. So doesn't mean the seductiveness causes the bad relationship, but rather what comes along with seductiveness. Maybe it's also that those same moms, like I just said, are just spending more time and paying more attention to the sons. So you got to be critical about what you read and think about, is this making both with what I say and what the book says and what you hear about, is this really making a causal statement or not? Is it really proving something about cause and effect about children's development and where it comes from? There's been a lot of correlational studies of watching violence on TV or in the movies. The higher these dots get up going this way, which is aggressive behavior. So higher leading to higher. A negative correlation would be, those red dots would be coming from the top left down to the right, top bottom right, meaning the. And so you see it's not a perfect correlation because, for example, Hillary here, let's call it, it's not exactly a 5, it's about a 4.5, let's say. No, that's not good. Yeah, no, it is. So Hillary, she watches this much TV, but then that dot right to the top left of her is watching less violent TV, but is actually displaying slightly more aggressive behavior. So it's not a perfect understanding of one or the other. So does this show that watching TV violence causes aggressive behavior in kids? No. What's that? It's related to it. And what would be some reasons why this doesn't show a causal relationship? What else might account for this kind of general pattern of dots? Bridget?
Well, obviously you can't prove causation unless you have an experiment. So.
Right, so Bridget says there might be a third variable, and that's an excellent point, that's causing both things. Maybe low income. So George maybe has these terribly controlling parents that never let him out of the household. That's not what Kim said. But we can imagine that you know, he doesn't get to leave the house, and he only gets to watch, he's 10 years old, but he only gets to watch Rugrats. And he, you know, and at the same time, it's because of this control of the kid, they never let him actually play with other kids either. So he never gets into fights because he's always inside and never out playing with kids. But so there might be, I mean, that was an extreme thing to say, but you know, you get the point that there might be a third variable that causes both of these things. Right, so the kid that he's hanging out with, maybe Spike is hanging out with kids, you know, from bad families, and he's going over their houses and watching violent TV, and then they go outside and, you know, shoot off bottle rockets and, you know, get the neighbor mad, and they end up getting fight with the neighbor's kids. But it's this influence by peers that's causing both of those things, both of these things to be high, as opposed to one thing exactly leading to the other. Aaron mentioned the idea that, well, maybe aggressive, kind of temperamentally aggressive kind of kids like watching TV. So you can either think of, so maybe the direction of effect isn't from the X to the Y, but rather from the Y to the X axis. So there maybe is a causal relationship, but maybe it's in the other direction of what we thought going into the study that we just did. Right here. So maybe it's going from aggression and aggressive personalities to the idea. In fact, we know that aggressive kids tend to like watching violent TV from ratings. Okay. So, and as what about time? What if we did a study where it was 10 years different? So we started last year. We did a survey of all of Baltimore County public school systems, like elementary school kids, however many kids that are 20,000 kids out. Rated how much they watched TV, had their parents rate that, had them rated violent TV, and then 10 years later from now, 2015, we see how much. So let's pretend we did it with first graders who are 5 or 6. And then we go back and do it 10 years later, and we see when they're 15 or 16 in high school, how many fights they're getting into. Well, that, I mean, this we measured 10 years earlier, so that definitely shows that this is influencing or causing this, correct? Yes or no? Okay, Bridget keeps coming back to this experiment, that you can't prove it unless it's experimental. And she's right. And time is a myth. And this is something, in fact, what did you just read in there? If you got that far in what I handed out. Aaron and Huseman are the researchers. And that study, you know, it's impressive in a lot of ways. I mean, longitudinal studies are kind of cool. 10 years later, you know, you're seeing what they look like later in life. But yet, it's still, and despite how large, how many kids they included, you know, it doesn't prove causation. It says nothing about causation. The same things that are true if you study something at the exact same time, if you did your questionnaires at the same time, are true. I mean, it very well could be that if we would have measured in that study, that hypothetical study we talked about, if we would have measured violence exposure 10 years from now and aggression now, maybe we would have, you know, if these things are both stable, if the same kids who are watching violent TV last year are watching it 10 years from now, the same kids who are getting into fights last year are getting into fights 10 years from now, you still haven't proved anything about causality. You still don't know what direction these errors are supposed to be going in. And as Bridget has told us a couple of times, the one thing that helps you establish causation are experiments. And now there have been many studies, experimental studies, of television violence and children's aggression, and I want to go over a couple of those and have us critique them and see what we think about these studies and what they prove and disprove. First of all, a study by Liebert and Barron in 1972. Grade school kids, 5 to 9-year-olds. Half of them watched The TV show, The Untouchables. You probably know the movie, The Untouchables. There was a TV show called The Untouchables. That was a black and white show. That was, I don't know, 60s. Anyway, that The Untouchables, you can see, had kind of violent acts in it. Half the kids watched those, the 3-minute clips of The Untouchables. The other half, they had watched an exciting track meet. Why would they have the other half of people watch an exciting track meet as opposed to just sitting there? Yeah.
I was just going to say, well, like watching a track meet, you know, kind of gets your hormones pumping, but without the violence part.
Right. So you want to be able to say that it's the actual violence depicted on the screen, as opposed to the fact that, well, maybe they were just kind of up and aroused and, you know, ready to go after they watched The Untouchables, because violent TV does tend to be arousing. So they wanted to keep that kind of level of arousal after watching it kind of similar. Okay. So they had them watch these 3-minute videos, and then they took them to a control room. It was like in a experiment, in a lab in a university. Take them to a control room, and then they said they were going to get to. There was another kid in another room playing a game, and they could either help or hurt this kid win their game. They were told this other kid was turning a game where they had to turn handles to like win prizes. And our kid who just watched the violent movie or the exciting track meet was in a room with buttons. They had a green button, which was the help button, or the red hurt button, which in fact, they were told that if they hit the red hurt button, it heated up these levers that the kid in the other room had to turn, so it made it harder to do. Of course, there was no kid in the other room, there were no levers, but these kids were told that, so they thought that. Well, what did they find? Not surprisingly, kids who had watched The Untouchables much more likely to press the hurt button, the red button. And this was especially true for the younger children, the 6-year-olds and the 7-year-olds in the study. More true than for the older kids. So does this study prove that watching TV violence causes aggression then? Yes or no? Daniel's saying that society, the media, is much more complex that faces children today than it was maybe back then. And that's true. And that's actually, it's not, it's a good point in that, just because, say, a study from either now or 30 years ago finds that in a laboratory that watching violence leads to aggression in kids, does that mean how much of an impact in the real world does that really have, given that the internet, video games, all these other ways that a kid can see violence, it's not like television is acting by itself out there. So even if it looks like in a lab it has a strong impact, in the real world does it have a strong impact? But regardless, does this study at all show us that watching TV violence at least causes aggression to some extent, at least in the context of this study? Yeah.
Well, all I'm saying is that, after watching a Jackie Chan movie, I'm going to want to bust up some of my friends with that kung fu.
You do?
Yeah, just because Jackie Chan's amazing. That's all I'm saying. So right afterwards, I want to go kung fu all over everyone. But I don't think I'm necessarily a violent person. Jackie Chan inspires me is all.
Okay, so right, and your name?
Peter.
Peter says Jackie Chan is inspiring, and who wouldn't want to beat up their friends after watching Jackie Chan movies? But say that in a different way. How is that a critique of this? What is that saying?
Well,
You're suggesting that what?
Well, I'm saying right after the movie.
Okay.
And so if they just watched The Untouchables, whatever, then they might be still in that mentality, where you're, violence, yeah, I want to make this harder for everyone else doing the lever thing, whatever. Whereas people with the track meet, probably oh man, this guy's working hard, I probably should help him out.
Right.
You know,
so
I think
it's a matter of, yeah, okay, so maybe this experiment does prove that it does cause aggression or something immediately after it, if you walk from this room to the next room. But does that mean in the real world, when I don't, when I'm done watching Jackie Chan, I usually kick back and, I don't know, have popcorn, and I don't go and, mix it up with my friends because they're not there, or, whatever. Good point, Peter. Yeah.
I think with, watching something like The Untouchables where they're just, punching each other and shooting each other, it might have a different effect, kind of depending on which kinds of violence you're watching.
Okay, so are you arguing, it sounds like, and tell me if I'm wrong, you're arguing that this might be more realistic violence than Jackie Chan violence. Is that what you're saying? Because of all the flips and stuff you're saying?
Yeah,
right.
Sort of.
And that's another point, kind of an aside point, which is, well, what kinds of violent TV or movies have an effect? And I would argue that for most kids, the kind of more subtle forms of violence, the more realistic form of violence, which some kids do, as somebody said earlier, they aren't able to distinguish reality from fiction as well as other kids are for different reasons because of their family environment or something like that. So they might be more likely to be influenced by that. Yeah.
Well, that's what I would say of this study is how many of these kids were coming from environments where guns and fights they saw, right before they went to sleep on their street outside versus kids that were living in, tree-lined streets in suburbia, mommy and daddy read you a book and tuck you in versus, these kids who listen to gunshots outside their window, Because that would make it more difficult, I think, even further difficult to distinguish real violence from a movie.
Okay, good point. And your name again?
Bridget.
Bridget. Good point. And actually, there's some other hands up, but we need to move on. But that leads us to the next study, so this found one thing, that younger kids seem to be more influenced by what they saw. But maybe there's other things, characteristics of kids that this study didn't look at that would be important to know in terms of who violence is really influencing or might possibly influence. So a second study I want us to look at. This was done with Belgian adolescents. Again, it's about 30 years old. And this is in like a detention center. These are adolescents who had gotten into some trouble, so they were in like a juvenile detention center, but they called them cottages. And before the study began, they went ahead and observed how aggressive these kids were. And so why would they do that? Well, it would be because of what Bridget just said. They wanted to know, which kids were aggressive in the first place, and might that be something that causes certain kids to be influenced more. A second reason they did that was of the 4 cottages they looked at, they found that overall 2 of the cottages on average had more aggressive kids and 2 less so. So that what they ended up doing was splitting this. They took a more aggressive cottage and a less aggressive cottage and showed them violent things. And then the other 2, they kind of showed them less violent things. So that's another critique of the last study, possibly. Well, we didn't know, so they randomly put kids into 2 groups to either watch The Untouchables or not. But how do we know that, even though it was done randomly, that by accident, all the kids who got into one group weren't more aggressive in the first place? So by doing this, looking at aggression beforehand, you can kind of control that or understand that, and then you can, pick them to be in certain groups of what they're going to watch in terms of TV or movies. Every night for a week, the cottages watch movies, a different movie every night, and they assign either all aggressive movies to one side, again, this is in the 70s, so they showed movies like Bonnie and Clyde, the Dirty Dozen, which is like a military movie, if you know that. A lot of shooting, fighting, things like that. they did, one thing they did was not look at just the temporary effects, but longer term. Not real long term, but a little long term in the sense that they watched for aggression that first week, but then also the second week when the cottages went back to the regular routine of watching whatever they watched in the evening. They continued to watch for aggression and see if people were teasing more, if they were getting into fights more, so on. What did they find? That indeed, yes, in those 2 cottages assigned to watch the violent movies, there was more aggression, especially in the evening, and especially in that one cottage of the 2 that was more aggressive. So again, back to Bridget's point, that maybe certain kids are more susceptible to the effects of TV violence, and in fact, that's what this study would say, or what it found, was that the kids in general and the more aggressive cottages were more influenced by it. Why might, especially in the evenings, they have seen more aggression? Well, and in this case, that's when they're watching the movies. So, kind of back to Peter's point, right after you see the movie, you might be more likely to act on it or to mimic the kind of phrases, tough phrases that you heard from the movie with your friends when something else is going on. Kim, right? So, maybe watching the violent movie, I don't know what the setting looked like, but, if in some way you associate watching the violent movie with whatever the room looks like you're hanging out with, but then when you go somewhere else, you kind of forget about it, and it doesn't have quite the same effect. In the second week, as you can see here, there wasn't physical aggression, like more fights or pushing, but verbal aggression, taunting and teasing, things like that. So it did have some effect longer term, at least, and they didn't look past the second week. So they did have a longer term effect, but only in terms of kind of verbal aggression and not physical. So what do you guys think then, from what you read in the article and the couple studies we just went over? Do you guys think that television violence causes aggression? And if so, for whom, Peter?
Well, I'm just wondering, actually, something else the opposite. I was wondering if there's ever been a study about people who do, like, kind acts after watching Barney or something.
Right.
I was wondering if there's ever been, like, the opposite study, the opposite side of the coin.
That's a good question. I don't know that anybody's done it quite like that. My guess is it would have an effect. We know that putting kids in a positive mood leads to, like, if you just have them think about happy stories, and then there's been people that have had them, like, give a chance to donate money to a kid who needs it, or to even be more quick to clean up. So putting them in a positive mood makes them kind of be more helpful and more compliant in ways. I don't know of studies that have done that with kind of like Barney or something like that, but I would expect that they do. Yeah. And we do know that, there was a study with Power Rangers in particular that had kind of the negative effects on kids. Like a cartoon, Power Rangers, of course, is a very violent cartoon, but had negative effects. We also know that Sesame Street, in fact, is a good thing for kids, that they learn more, not necessarily get more compliant or helpful, but in terms of learning their ABs and C's, Sesame Street is a good thing. Other thoughts? Why is television violence, is it causal? Do we think it's causing some of the violence that we see in kids, or aggression? Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think it is. One of the ways like people learn is by modeling the behavior of others. So if you're constantly bombarded with like violent stimuli, that's what you're recording. That's what your brain is going to recognize and respond to.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And your name?
Dimitri.
Dimitri says, well, sure. If you see it, if that's being modeled, then you're being more likely to take it on and do it yourself. So there's a lot of violence that isn't in kind of dramatization, but rather real violence that's put on TV. Do we think that has a similar impact? Thoughts on that as other things? A related point is, which is what a lot of people say, well, kids that are watching a lot of TV and a lot of TV with violence, like, what are they not doing when they're watching, violent movies each night or something like that. What more positive shows are they not watching, and/or what kind of playing with other kids are they not doing? And this is certainly, when it comes to video games, a strong argument that people make, like violent video games. People are worried about kids. We know kids learn a lot of social skills, like how to get along with each other, by actually just having to get along with each other. I think kids kind of learn it, work it out, and learn skills as they do so. And so if they're playing violent video games all afternoon, or any video games all afternoon, there might be a concern about that. Yeah, that's Albert Bandura. There's kind of some famous psychological studies, which goes back to Dimitri's point about modeling, which is, they're called the Bobo doll studies, where there's kind of, you see a video of a kid beating up on a Bobo doll, and then, then the kid, if left alone in the room, is more likely to become aggressive with another kid, the play partner, and play kind of aggressively with the toys.